What's up, magical misfits? Drew here, and this video is actually a viewer request. And the question mainly revolves around the disposal of spell components. Now, of course, in this video, you're going to be hearing my voice. So you're going to get my thoughts and opinions and experiences on the topic. There is so much information out on the internet about this. Articles, blogs, videos, you can find so much more information. But this is what I have to offer on the topic. So first and foremost, I want to say that there is no short right answer to this question. No one short right answer anyway. In my mind, what would be done with the remnants of a working depend heavily on the components used in the spell, the intention of the spell, and then sort of the environmental circumstances. So, I, for example, live very, very near the beach and even closer to the forest. There's a running river very close to here. I'm also close to the sound, but I don't have a pond. While we do have swamps here, I'm not very close to them. I don't have a really arid desert environment close to me. I don't have mountains close to me. So my geography and what's going on in my environment around me. Also, I have a standalone home. I have a very large backyard and a nice front yard. So obviously, if I lived in an apartment, my environmental circumstances would be very different. So for me, there's a few questions I want to ask myself. At this point in my practice, I don't need to ask those questions, but initially there were things to think about. So the first one being, do I want the effects of this spell to continue on in relation to being tied to these components? Do I want it to sort of be preserved and to continue to feed into the intention of the spell and into the energy of the spell? Or do I want it to sort of be a one and done and the components no longer hold any import or matter? Then, again, what resources do I have at my disposal? What does my environment and my lifestyle offer me with regards to how I might dispose of the remnants of a spell? And obviously, what was the spell for? I feel that that is really important in how personally I dispose of my remnants. I feel like as a practitioner of magic, as a witch, I need to be responsible for my spell from step A, B, C, and beyond. From beginning to end, I need to be responsible for what it is I'm doing. So I need to see it through to the end, and I need to be responsible with how I dispose of the remnants, keeping those factors that I've already mentioned, those circumstances, those situations in mind as I move forward. And I don't think I can stress that enough. As I go through my thought process in this and how I handle the situation, hopefully it'll be reiterated, personal accountability and responsibility for what it is we are doing. My best, most basic, simple, common sense sort of answer to this question of how to dispose of spell components is to use the elements. And I am speaking specifically about earth, air, fire, and water. These are elements that we all can get our hands on and have exposure to, interact with on some level, regardless of our circumstance. Even if I live in an apartment in the city, I can get potting soil if I have to, if I need something for earth, or I can go on a trip and get some earth from somewhere, or whatever. There is some way for me to have an interaction with and the ability to work with these four elements and thus be able to dispose of a spell properly and respectfully by use of these elements. So obviously, when we're talking about the elements, certain things come to mind first. So earth, for example, the first thing anybody's going to think of is burying. But I would argue that there are other ways that you could use the earth if you get creative. For instance, if you want to just neutralize the energy of a spell on a component that you wish to work with again, you could use the earth to do that. You could use earth energies to ground, dissipate, transmute, whatever, the energies of the spell. Again, laying the component on the earth, burying it in some earth, not necessarily digging a hole in your yard, but even just having a little pot with soil in it and just kind of tucking it in there, maybe on your altar or something like that. And of course, earth can obviously very powerfully ground any energy from a spell and its remnants. Air, the first thing that's going to come to mind is kind of scattering ashes to the wind. But again, air could be used as a cleansing, purification, that kind of thing. I always want to take into consideration the properties. So communication, intellect, those kind of things, and maybe get creative with how I use that element to dispose of a spell if I'm using it in that way. Fire, the obvious thing is burning, and honestly, that's probably the only way that I would use fire for this purpose. Fire is very purifying, but you know, if anything other than maybe metal that you stick into fire even briefly can be damaged or altered by the fire, and typically will be. And that includes crystals and minerals. Your crystals and minerals can absolutely be damaged, if not destroyed, by fire. And then water, being most people probably thinking of sort of cleansing or releasing, but it could also be used in a few other ways, which I'm about to get into. But before that, I do want to say that if you are part of a specific tradition or you are influenced by a specific tradition, you feel called to it and you really want to sort of work in that vein, then obviously, you know, you may want to look into whether or not that specific tradition has specific rules, ideas, and practices when it comes to disposing of spell remnants, because from what I understand, they often do. But in general, if we're just talking about your everyday witch who doesn't follow a specific tradition, then here's sort of my take on working with the elements to properly, respectfully, safely dispose of spell remnants. So we're going to start with earth. Again, this is coming purely from my own personal thought process and experience. For me, the first thing I'm going to say is obviously we want to be earth conscious when we practice this. And that's true of all the elements, really. We want to think of safe, healthy, environmentally sound ways to work with these elements. We don't want to be burying toxins and harmful things in the earth that, I mean, it doesn't even have to be like environmentally unfriendly. Like if you're burying items that could be potentially dangerous if someone stumbles upon them, like rusty nails and screws and glass and whatever in the earth, you either need to be burying it very deeply or it needs to be handled in a manner that makes it safe. Again, this idea of being responsible, just be responsible. And I think that, you know, most of us that practice witchcraft, even if we don't identify as pagan, we tend to care about the earth. So I don't think I have to stress it overly much, but you know, it should be said. An example I will use of this is something that, like salt. I mean, yes, salt can be toxic in high enough quantities and concentrations, but in and of itself, salt is fine. But I personally don't like to use salt on the earth. Now, I do use salt. I work with salt in spells, and I will use it on my patio or my front porch. Well, it's more of a stoop, whatever. Concrete, things like that. And I have occasionally and will occasionally work with it on the earth, but I try to do so in small quantities because salt really isn't good for plants and stuff. You don't want to just dump a bunch of salt. It's going to change the properties, the pH, whatever. It's going to change the way things grow, the quality of the soil and the earth in the place where it is. So I typically don't like to use that on the earth. I'm not going to go around burying large quantities of salt in the earth. Personal choice, of course, but we just have to look at these things and analyze whether what we're doing is safe or not. And again, that's for each of us to decide on our own how we want to handle it. I'm not going to tell anyone else how to walk their path and what that looks like and how they should think, feel, or believe when it comes to anything, even environmentalism. Okay, back to the topic at hand. I typically bury spell jars or spell bottles. That's just me. That's not to say that I bury every spell jar or every spell bottle I make, not by a long shot, but typically when I bury something in the earth, that's what it is. It's a personal preference, and that comes down to the fact that for me, burying something in the earth is about either binding it, preserving it, or neutralizing it, grounding it, that kind of thing. Now, the neutralization part typically doesn't have anything to do with the intent of the spell. It's my intent for the remnants of the spell, whereas the binding and the preservation absolutely have to do with the intent of the spell. The binding in particular. If I have done a working that I can pop open the jar or the bottle and dump just the remnants of that into the earth on their own, that's great, but typically that's not the case for me. that would be great because then I could reuse the bottle and we're reducing our waste and what have you. And it will all just sort of break down as long as it's organic in nature. But that's not typically how I do. I typically bury the whole bottle. And that's because what is inside of it isn't always, well, it's not always all organic. And I'll give some examples. So I've talked about this a bit on my channel, but there are some family issues. We are estranged from a few different family members for different reasons. The estrangement came about for everyone involved just over the past couple years. Last year, before we became estranged from a couple specific family members, there was an issue that led up to the estrangement. I mean, it's been years, it's been building for years, but the specific issue was that these Catholic members of our extended family came into our home and I guess were horrified and didn't let us know they were horrified and were sort of passive aggressive about it, really. They had known for years that we were pagan and that we were witches, and we knew they were Catholic. We just sort of, from our perspective, had let bygones be bygones and forgot about it. But essentially what happened is they put a green scapular in our home. And long story short, a green scapular is designed for you to pray over and to pass to someone. You give it to them so that they may be converted to Catholicism. If that's not an option because they're not open to it, you hide it somewhere near their person. And this is what happened. They hid it in our home and we found it. So we did a binding on the scapular and we made it so not only the scapular itself was bound to this spell bottle, but so that any energy or intent that they were still feeding and still feed into that scapular also went into that jar. It was layered with ingredients. One of the ingredients was salt, which I don't want in the earth. And I also had it layered in a certain way. It was set up in a certain way with the scapular in the middle. I will insert a picture. Then we took this bottle because we did not want it in our home. We didn't want that energy still coming into our home. And we went out into the woods, into the forest, and buried it in the middle of the forest. Now, I am fortunate that the forest that I live in basically is a national forest. It is preserved. I don't have to worry about them tearing down the trees and building homes there anytime soon. I wanted to bury this because I am binding it and I want it to be contained and held in that place, and because I want it away from it. And so this is why I chose to bury those spell components as my way of being done with that. Another example of this is banishing. There are times when I will bury a banishing and I will handle it the same way, as in I will go out into the forest, bury it, and ask and have the intention that the earth's energies transmute whatever is there and hold it and make it safe for anybody who stumbles upon it. And I will turn my back on it and walk away from it, never looking at it again. I am totally done with you. So that's an example of transmuting the earth, burying something for the earth to transmute that energy. Preservation. When I bury things for preservation, okay, once again, those same family members, the Catholics, again, it's been, well over a decade, almost 2 decades, building of this animosity almost. There's been some really hurtful, nasty things said. And even after the scapular incident, we weren't estranged. We were trying to still work on it. And more hurtful, nasty things were said, and we finally walked away. But in the meantime, I did a spell here on the channel. It was a see no evil, speak no evil, think no evil spell. And I didn't actually explain what I was doing, but I just showed you, I just let you watch. And the remnants of that spell afterward, it was basically designed so that if you think about us, you talk about us, you put your attention on us at all, that it's all loving and respectful and done in a nice way. That was, the hope. So the remnants of that spell, they were in a jar, stayed in our home for a little while, a couple months. And then I just intuitively knew that it needed to go out. And so I took it, and my husband and I went to one of the back corners of our property and buried it in the ground there. And I wanted it on the property because it's tied to us, and it's sort of a protective measure in a way, right? For my family to keep harmony and peace and what have you, have well-being. And so I wanted it to remain on the property, and I wanted it to be preserved, and for that energy and intention to continue, the spell to continue. Another preservation I did for another member of the family, I also did this on the channel. I made a swamp jar, and I took that, and so it had swamp water in it. It had broken glass and, you know, big thorns and nails and pins and just all kinds of nasty things in there. And then a picture of that person that the spell is tied to. And I took that spell out to the very front of my property and buried it, because the intention was that it be preserved there and that the magic continue to flow. And that anytime that individual tries to come onto my property, that they feel very uncomfortable energetically. They're not welcome. And that was sort of the idea behind that. I buried another one I made on the channel, hot foot jar. Again, same person, get out of my life. And I took the jar, and there's a lot of ways that you can deal with that. You can break it on their doorstep. I mean, there's a lot of ways you could deal with a hot foot situation. And my understanding is it would be better if that individual could walk through the huff of powder, but that was not a feasible outcome for me. So I took it and buried it at the crossroads in the neighborhood in which the individual lives. I felt that burying it at that crossroads in their neighborhood would preserve and intensify what it was that I was doing with that spell. Crossroads being the part that would intensify it. So for me, again, I am looking at what it is that the earth does, the properties associated with the earth, but then I am also looking at what it is that my intention was for the spell and what I want to happen with that. So binding, transmutation, neutralization, and preservation. Typically for me, it's binding and preservation, but there are occasions when I bury something for those other two intentions. I'm going to tack throwing things in the trash on here. I do know that there are witches that do that. I myself am not crazy about that idea. For me, it's not that there's nothing wrong with it at all. It just, for me, feels like I'm not seeing it through to the end, is kind of the way I feel about it. I don't like it. However, I have done it once. For me, it's kind of a last resort option. Like, I feel like I have no other course of action to take with those remnants, because I can't safely dispose of them with one of the 4 elements. I mean, it's still technically earth, but Dani Mystic recently did a video on this herself. And in her video, she gave the example of a tea light tin. I was looking around for one, but I don't see one. The little tin that the tea lights come in. Like, that's just trash. When you're done, what do you do with that? You throw it away. And that's kind of what happened. I honestly don't even remember what the spell was for, but I know that what was left, I was just like, what do I do with this? And the only thing that made sense to me was to throw it in the trash. So I took a cloth bag. I put everything that was left in the cloth bag. And I don't remember, it was probably loose white sage or cedar, maybe even some cedarwood oil. I may have put salt, though I doubt it, but something to neutralize that. So that way, when it gets to the landfill or on the way to the landfill, if anybody comes into contact with it, because I'm pretty sure it was I wouldn't say malicious, but it wasn't a nice spell. Let's put it that way. And the remnants were not anything that I could safely dispose of via the elements. So I also did not want that energy or intention to get on anybody who might come into contact with it between me and the landfill or after that. So, I put something in to neutralize those energies and to end that working, and then threw the cloth bag in the trash. Air is not an element that I regularly use for spell disposal. Typically, if I do this, it's because it ties into the spell. I am doing a releasing, and so I've burned a petition or some herbs or something, and I'm just throwing them to the wind. But, I mean, obviously you could use the wind, air, to dispose of spell components, but they would need to be something that could be scattered to the winds, obviously. So that's typically going to be herbs or ashes or something like that. For me, if I'm going to be using this method, I would like to have a good strong wind. And so the thought occurred to me, I do live in a place where we actually get tropical storms and hurricanes. So I could potentially do a powerful release work or something like that, a spell for releasing, and throw the remnants, throw what I've got there into the wind, and those powerful winds of a tropical storm or a hurricane, which sparked another thought. So I have used this method for binding more than once, but I thought, oh, I could do it for the releasing too. So I could potentially do the spell right now if I needed to, and then preserve, store safely keep those remnants until a storm came up. I'm sure that any of you who have done workings will realize that there are times when you do a working and you can't, you have to wait. For one reason or another, you have to wait to properly dispose of the remnants. Now for me, when that is something, for example, that I have bound, I did a binding and I'm binding an energy to the components, the remnants of the spell, and I want to get it away from me and out, but I can't. I have to wait a few days or whatever. It's raining like cats and dogs for a week. I don't know. Whatever the reason is, I have what I refer to as a bell jar. This is just a weird little old jar that I got secondhand. I've used this from the very beginning of my practice. And then I have this nice hunk of hematite here. And what I will do is put those components in this bottle and set the hematite on top. And it's already set up. It's already enchanted. I don't know what other word to use. I've already given this jar a job. Its job is to hold whatever's inside of it intact, be bound to the jar until I can take it out and do what I want to do with it. So again, if I wanted to do some big release work, I could put the remnants in here, store it until the hurricane came or whatever, and then release it to the winds. That's another handy little tip in my mind. Sometimes the components of a spell can't be gotten rid of right then and there. And if it's a spell that you don't want the energy just oozing out all over your home, having a place to keep it contained is a good idea. Next is my favorite method of disposing of spell components, and that is fire. So for me, burning is all about either neutralization, releasing, or transmutation. Like I would never burn something that I was trying to bind. If I did a binding spell and I had remnants, I would never burn those, because to me, that would just be releasing the whole thing, letting it go. Even though it could be neutralizing and disposing of those, I'm going to bury them. That's just my preference. There's obviously going to be a few different ways you can handle this. I think the most obvious would be like using a cauldron or a fire pit, a bonfire, that kind of thing. I personally use these two differently. For me, the cauldron is only going to come into play if it is tied to the spell. The actual burning is part of the spell. For me, that's not about disposing of leftover spell components. And I personally keep that ash and reuse it, recycle it in magic later. Now with the fire pit, we have at least 2 fires a year at the solstices. And even if we use that ritual fire for another reason, we know it's always going to be about disposal of spell components. I have this tin that lives in a little box that sits under my working altar in the living room. And right now, the only thing that's in here are incense sticks. The stick that's left over after the incense is burnt. And, oh, the box smells amazing though. Match sticks. That's all that's in there right now. I am one who will write down the name of a person a spell is for and anoint it with oil and put it under a candle if it's going to be a candle spell. So anything like that will go in this tin. Last year around Samhain, I did a air dry clay release spell here on my channel, and I made a little disc of air dry clay for the spell, and afterward I had that. So I threw it in here. Anything, candle wax that I don't want to use again in the future for any reason, anything that I'm done with and I no longer need, I will put in here. And then I will go out at the solstice, summer, winter, and burn them in the fire. Again, that's going to come down to the intent of the spell. There are certain things that I would not put in here and hold. I would either go ahead and burn them right away, or I'd bury them because I just didn't feel comfortable having that energy sitting around in my home. But a lot of the things that will go in here have to do with, healing. Like I did a spell for COVID at the beginning of the year, and anything that was left over from that went in here, and like anything like that. A lot of the spells I do, I don't have a problem with the remnants of those spells hanging out in my house for 6 months, or however, every 6 months we have a fire at least. So, for however long it sits in the house, I don't have a problem with that. If it's something that's going to be a problem, I'll handle it right away. The last element is water. This is also one that I don't use often, purely because I don't feel great about it. I have thrown lots of crystals and like organic, natural, like acorns, whatever, you know, pieces of nature into the ocean and the sound and local rivers. I have also put herbs in, though that's typically going to be something like a lavender or rose, because I don't want to put, for instance, a huge handful of mandrake or belladonna in the water. I'm always concerned there are things living in that water, and that's, you know, burying something in the earth, it's iffy as well, but depending on how you handle it, it's still, in my mind, safer than just throwing stuff in the water. That makes me really uncomfortable. But I have done this, again, I have. And as far as what I do or how I do it depends on the water. So if it's running water, like the ocean or a river or a brook or whatever, then for me, this would be about releasing or bringing movement to the spell. But like a swamp or a pond or something like that, it would be about preservation, possibly binding, or even stagnation, like adding that to a spell. Again, not one that I'm personally crazy about. I think that if I really wanted to use water, I might try to get creative. And if it were something I wanted to do regularly, I might build a little pond in my backyard, just a tiny little water feature, or I don't know, a fountain of some kind, but I wouldn't want to just be running around polluting the water around me. And even just dropping, you know, I'm not going to put wax in the water where the fish might eat it or a crab might eat it or something, or even a spell bottle. I don't feel great about that kind of stuff personally. So it is possible. And depending on your situation, where you're at, what's going on around you and how you feel about it, it's an option for sure. But it's not one that I'm crazy about. All of these are problematic. You know, we have to think about what it is we're doing and be responsible for what we're doing. The last way in my mind to deal with the remnants of a spell is to recycle and reuse. So we already touched on reuse. Like if you can dump the components out of a spell bottle and reuse that bottle, crystals, you know, you can cleanse them. There are lots of components that could come into your working that you could potentially reuse. When I say recycle, I'm talking about magically recycling. So another example of a spell that was done for one of those problematic relatives I discussed earlier was a narcissism spell. A spell that my intention was that this individual see how their actions created everything. And maybe they could see themselves and take some accountability, which is very difficult for narcissists, but if not impossible. But this is the remnants of that spell. It has been about a year now since I did the spell, maybe a little more. This is not a candle. This is, there might be crystals in here. I'm not sure, but there's definitely, looks like maybe a petition right here. I'm not sure. There's definitely candle wax from a couple different candles. There's oils, there's incense ash, like everything that was in the spell, I layered into this bottle. Now, I did see some measure of success from that spell, but it wasn't as nice as I would like it to be. So I am going to pop this open, put it in my double boiler on the stove, melt it down. I'm going to add some more components in, put a wick in, and make this a candle and rework that spell. I'm recycling that magic and hopefully strengthening it and making it better. So that's what I mean by recycling, taking elements of a spell that were either greatly successful and using them in other applications that might be similar or not, or a spell that wasn't as successful as maybe you would like and retooling it. That's an option as well. Okay, the last thing I want to touch on really quick is a little bit about oils. And this is because the viewer who requested this video specifically mentioned oils as well. So first off, the shelf life of an oil. So different oils are going to have different shelf life. So look at different bases you could use. So for example, olive oil is going to have a certain length that people, you know, before it goes bad, before it turns. And you can find that information out on the internet. But the same would be true of jojoba or sunflower or grapeseed or whatever. So you can look and see maybe which one, you know, which of these oils might be the best at its price point as far as longevity, and make those decisions as far as what you want your carrier oil to be. Secondly, adding essential oils to an oil helps preserve it and make it last a little bit longer. My best advice, however, for preserving oils is glycerin. Now, you can get it online for sure, but you can get it at a lot of times at drugstores or at places like Walmart. You can find it in 2 sections. It'll be either in cooking with the baking goods or in like self-care with like soap and, you know, lotions and stuff like that. It's definitely going to be cheaper in the self-care section than in the baking section. It's going to take me a while to get through this bottle. I typically make almost all of my oils just because I really enjoy doing that. A small bottle of oil, like something this size, I'd put a good little splash in. A little vial would just a drop, 2-3 drops in there. It doesn't take a whole lot, but it definitely helps preserve your oil and give it longer shelf life. As far as knowing when your oils aren't good anymore, when we're talking about magical oil, first off, never put any raw ingredients like herb, plant material, living plant material in, because it's just going to mold and ruin your oil. Make sure everything is fully cured and dried before you put it in. In my mind, they don't go bad as far as the magic goes. What I mean is, the longer my oil sits, the more it's infusing with whatever I've put in there. So that's crystals, herbs, oils, whatever, and is becoming stronger and stronger and more potent over time. That's how it works in my mind. Having said that, the oil will turn eventually, and it starts to smell sour. To smell your oil, and if it starts to smell like it's turning, eventually it'll be rancid. But when it starts to smell off and it doesn't smell like it should, then you know it's time to make a new oil. I personally have had oils for years and years and years. As long as you take proper steps to preserve them and you store them in a cool, dark place, you can keep an oil for a very long time. Now, as far as disposing of them when they do finally go bad, this was a conundrum for me myself for a long time. Fortunately, though, there's a beautiful witch here on YouTube. Her channel is AmberMoon WitchOfSolstice. And forever ago now, she did a video where she talked about how she disposes of her oils. And I haven't needed to do this yet, but I've already set up for it. So what I've done is I had a concrete planter, and I've put it in the place that I wanted to live in the yard, and I've put dirt in there. And that's just what it's going to be for. When I need to dispose of oils, I'm going to dump them in that dirt in that planter. And that way it's somewhat protected. Oil is a tricky thing to get rid of, even like cooking oil. I don't know about everywhere else, but here you take it to them and they dispose of. Like, I don't even know what they do with it, but we don't just throw it in the trash, right? Oil is tricky. It has to be disposed of properly. So that's the only method that I feel comfortable with as far as my magical oils are concerned at this time, is just to have this planter with the soil and our dirt and just pour out the oil into that dirt as it goes bad. But again, I haven't needed to do that since I saw her video, which it's probably been over a year since I've seen that video. I don't know when the last time I needed to get rid of an oil was, because I take steps to preserve them and I store them properly. So yeah, I guess that's it. That's my advice. This video is so long. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that was helpful on some level. Until next time, much love and gratitude.